All right, so we're going to start talking about drawing in Adobe Animate. And before we talk about that, you have to understand that Adobe Animate might be a little bit different than some other drawing programs you've used, okay? Adobe Animate is what we call a vector drawing program, okay? Meaning that it doesn't draw the way, say, Photoshop would draw or some other, similar type programs. Instead of using pixels to draw, it uses something called vectors to draw. Okay. This is kind of similar to Adobe Illustrator, if you've ever used that program, or Figma. There's some other programs out there that are vector based. So the idea is that a raster program, like say Adobe Photoshop, or I believe Procreate is like this, when it draws, it fills in little pixels, okay? So like think of them as little Legos, and each one of these can have its own color, and I can make this red, green, blue, so on and so on. And you get enough pixels together and you form composition, okay? Vector graphics are a little different because instead of drawing in little squares, really what you're doing is you are drawing lines, and those lines eventually form a shape, like a square or a rectangle or something like that, like this. Now, in this case, I'm doing kind of very linear things, but it could also be like a circle like that, something like that. So vectors are really more about building shapes than doing individual pixel work. Okay. There are some benefits to vector graphics over raster graphics. One is that when you enlarge a vector graphic, it does not blur. Okay. The reason for this is that vectors are based on mathematical formulas instead of being based on the number of pixels you have. So why that might be useful is, let's say you started your composition really small, like say 720 by 480, and then you wanted to blow it up to 4K resolution, which is much bigger. If it was a raster-based project, like say video, like if you record video and you try to blow it up, it's going to look really distorted, okay? Because you can't do that very well with raster graphics, okay? They're getting better with AI, but like it's still not very good. Vectors, though, it's very easy to enlarge something without losing distortion, because really vector graphics are all just a bunch of mathematical formulas. The way I kind of explain it is, imagine that I have this triangle. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, my triangle's formula is X, right? If you want to make it twice as big, well, in math, you would just say, well, make it 2X or 5X or 100X, You just take whatever it is and you just multiply it out. And so that's why it's really easy with vectors to blow stuff up and you don't have any problems with it, okay? Some other things, vectors have real curves. That's not going to become really relevant in this course, but in other areas of design where you're doing laser cutting or something, that might be really relevant. Vector files are smaller than raster files. Unfortunately, we're going to always be exporting as video. So technically, our final product is never going to be a vector. It's going to be a raster. So this isn't going to come into play in this particular program, in this particular class. Other classes where you might use vectors, this might be relevant. Okay. Like I said, Adobe, So the thing about vectors is a vector graphic has two visual parts, what is called the fill and what is called the stroke. Okay. The fill is the interior of the shape. It could be a solid color. It could be a gradient or a blend between multiple colors, or it could even be like a design, like a repeatable pattern, like wallpaper, you know. It also has what's called a stroke. The stroke goes around the perimeter of the shape, okay? Fill, stroke, fill, stroke, fill, stroke, okay? Oops. So what I'm going to do is let's edit the fill of this star here. So what I'm going to do is grab the selection tool. Also, I'm going to refer to it usually as the black arrow. And I'm going to click right here. Oops, I have to make sure it's unlocked. There we go. All right, so when I've done that, it kind of, you see all these little dots there. That means it's selected. And what's going to happen is over here in my properties panel, you're going to see where it says fill. So the fill is the fill color. If I click on it, you're going to see I get these little swatches. So I could quickly change the color using that. If you want a color that's not here, you could actually click on the little color wheel in the upper right-hand corner. And this will pull open a color picker, which is a much more specific way of choosing color. So if I wanted to choose an exact shade of color here, I could do it that way. Okay. So you can either choose a color here, or you can go to the color wheel here. If you want to set, you can also change the alpha. Alpha means the opacity of it, which is how transparent it is. So if I was to set this to 50% alpha, what that means is this is kind of like, think of it as colored glass, where like it has a color, but it's not entirely opaque. You can see through it. So if I was to select this, I guess this is actually, let me raise this up. See how you can like see through this to the item below it? That's the opacity, okay? So, you know, if I raise this back to 100, now it's opaque. If I set it to 0, it's literally invisible, okay? So you can play around with that. I'm going to select the stroke, okay, which is clicking on the edge here. If I click on that, you can see this gets highlighted. Notice I only actually really select part of the stroke. If you're used to programs like Illustrator or Figma, you don't have this issue. But in Adobe Animate, we're going to try to select the whole stroke. I'm going to do that by double clicking. So 1, 2, and that selects the whole stroke here. Now you can see this is giving me stroke options as opposed to fill options. This is my color. So if I want to switch this to, you know, a different color like we did for the fill, I can do that. You can choose your own color once again if you want to be more precise about colors. You can also change the style of the stroke. So here under style, right now it's set to like a basic, you know, thick line. I could do it as a thinner line. I could do it as a dash line. This is what's called a ragged line. So it's, you know, less formal. There is a striped line, strip line, which is kind of like little dots. Hatched lines. I'm just going to set it back. There's also this thing called a stroke size. This is the thickness of the stroke. So right now it's set to 0.1, which is the thinnest possible, but I could, you know, make it thicker, or thinner to make the stroke thicker or thinner. Another thing is right now you'll notice that my stroke is what we call a uniform thickness. What that means is like it's the same distance here as it is there, as it is there, as it is there. Now that's fine, but it tends to make your design look a little more kind of mechanical because when you draw, you know, when people draw with a pencil, you can't really always get the same thickness, you know, when you press down. It's very hard to do that. So it tends to make it look a little more less organic, more mechanical. One thing we could do is play around with the width option here. So what I'm going to do is click. Oops, what happened? I don't know what happened here. Of course, now that I have to show it, it doesn't work. Wait, does it come back in? I don't know what happened to it. Here, I'm gonna quit the program and come back to. Sometimes this happens where there's a bug. You may want to forward like 10 seconds ahead, 5 seconds. Okay, there we go. So right now, this is a uniform thickness. This, if you look at this thing here, might be hard to zoom in, but see how this line starts thin and then it gets thick and then it goes back to thin. So what this means is like this line, how thick or thin this line is represents how thick or thin your stroke will be at certain points. So if I click on this, see how it starts thin and then it gets thick and then it goes back to thin, just like this does, thin, thick, thin. This one starts thin, it goes to thick, it goes back to thin, it goes back to thick, it goes back to thin. Okay. So the point here is this, is a little more organic. It's not so perfect, right? We don't always want things to be too perfect because then it doesn't, it has a kind of very computery type kind of feel to it. Okay. All right, let's talk about drawing shapes. So to draw shapes, let's just start with the basic. I'm going to go about 7 down. This allows me to create a shape. I'm going to start with a rectangle. For now, we're not going to use the primitives. We'll come back to those later in today's lesson. And this is my, when I start with this is my, over here, this is the fill color and this is the stroke color. Okay, so right now my fill color is like a purple and my stroke color is kind of like a brown. I'm gonna kind of change this. Let's make this kind of like a light pink. And I'll make this a darker pink. Okay. All right, so this is gonna be my fill and my stroke. You can always, go back and change that later if you'd like to. I'm gonna click and drag and that creates a rectangle. Okay. If I want to make a perfect square, hold down the shift key when you draw. You can see I make a square. If you want to start from the center rather than starting from the upper left, hold down the Option or the Alt key. And it starts in the center. Okay. So, this your stroke options will be whatever your last stroke options were. So these are my last stroke options. So that's, when I draw new ones, that's going to be the stroke options it uses. Just like we did before, if you want to go back and make changes, you can always go back and make changes. So if I click, you can see it gives me the fill color. I can, reset the fill here to different colors. Maybe I want to reset the stroke color and the style. Okay. All of that can be done really quickly. Okay. One interesting thing about vectors in Adobe Animate as opposed to other vector-based programs is that your fill and your stroke are technically not attached to each other. So what that means is like if I click here, I've actually only selected the fill and not the stroke. So if I click and drag with the selection tool, it only actually moves the fill and not the stroke. Same thing if I click here, I'm actually only highlighting the stroke and not the fill. Okay, so this can be a little tricky for some people. If you want to move both, what I would suggest doing is when you highlight, do a double click. So if I click once, I'm just actually highlighting the fill and not the stroke. But if I click twice, 1, 2, now I actually have both and I can move both. Okay. You want to remove a shape, once you highlight it, you can just use the delete or the backspace key and that'll delete the whole thing. So I can make a rectangle. I can make an oval. So click and drag. You can see it's using my last options here. Let's switch that back. Click and drag. Okay, it makes an oval shape. If you want to make a perfect circle, pull down Shift. You can see I made a perfect circle. If you want to start from the center rather than starting the upper left, hold down the Option or the Alt key and drag. You can also use the polygon shape. Okay, this makes a multi-shaped side. So if I can, right now, so your options are once you have this tool and it's going to say Polystar here in your properties panel. And then if you go down to where it says tool options, see how it says polygon and then it says the number of sides. So it says 5. So that means when I draw, I'll make a pentagon shape. If it was 6 sides, it would be a hexagon shape. 8 sides, octagon shape, so on and so on. You can also use the Polystar tool to build a star rather than a polygon shape. To do that, under Style, switch it from polygon to star, and then this is down the number of points of the star rather than the sides of the shape. So if I set this to 5, I'm going to make a 5-pointed star. If I set this to 8, and I click and drag, I will make an 8-pointed star, so on and so on. Let's talk about using the brush tool, okay? This is our classic brush tool. I'm going to grab it. What the brush tool does is it paints the fill, okay? So right now my fill is my green, so that's going to be the color that I'm going to paint with. Over here, this is how we can change the settings of our lines. So, right, I can make my thing bigger or smaller by using this size here. You want to change it on the fly. You can use the left and right bracket keys. You can see, I'm just using the left and right bracket keys. You can see those numbers are changing. And it's making thinner and thinner lines, or I'm going up to make thicker lines. I wish, unfortunately, in other programs, the little crosshair would actually change size. It doesn't do that in Animate. I don't know why. It does do that in programs like Photoshop and such. It's kind of a shame it doesn't do that. But you can, make different sizes here. We can also change the brush type. Or is that under fluid brush? We also have smoothing. What smoothing does is it actually will, when you draw, smooth out your edges. So what that means is if you are drawing, I'm gonna make this a little smaller. Let me use like a red so it's a little easier to see. So when I draw here, see I'm getting really smooth edges when I do that, right? If you set this to now when I do this, See, it's a little more, it's a little more fidgety when you do that type. Okay. You can also change your brush a little bit. It defaults to being a circle, but you can make it a square. This is brush type. Ah, there it is, brush type. There's some built-in brush types here. If you're used to something like Photoshop, it's not as great a selection, but you do have different types that you can play around with, or you can make your own. You can make the circle more or less flat. You can change the direction of it. So this is like my new little brush. It can also be a square or a rectangle. Get some interesting, variations in lines and such. All right. Why don't you guys try that out? That's 4, 5, and 6. So practice selecting and making modifications to stroke and fill, and then make your own shapes. Practice, being able to edit them, draw them and edit them using the tools here, and practice using the classic brush there to draw and paint.